and get started. Our industrial revolution was built upon a vast, cheap, expendable resource, namely children. I think when we think of the Industrial Revolution, we think of the great engineers, Stephenson, Brunel, and so on, but we need to remember that 40% of the population in the early Victorian period were under 15. 40% were under 15, and children started work at the age of 4 or 5, poor children. The idea of childhood being a special protected stage of life, is something that developed during the Victorian period, and that development of that idea of childhood is something that I want to talk about today as well. And I'll use paintings where I can, but and photographs, but bear in mind that they need to be interpreted, as you'll see. Over the period, a 60-year period, the population of this country tripled, but the average wealth doubled. So if you calculate that, it means the total wealth of the country over just 60 years increased sixfold. And it's not often mentioned, but one of the reasons that we achieved that is was the exploitation of poor children in Britain. It was the second half of the 19th century that saw childhood slowly recognized as a special period in life, and the modern idea of childhood developed. I'll be talking about the rich and the poor, the rich versus the poor, the move from countryside to towns, the Victorian family unit, and a lot of what I'm going to say is quite dark. So I'll end on a lighter note when I talk about the invention of holidays. So let's start with the rich and the poor. And I won't be telling you a lot about the artist or some of the general aspects of these paintings, because I'm concentrating on the children in the paintings. But I often need to talk a bit about the background. This was by William Bell Scott, and it's called, or its brief title is Iron and Coal. And it's one of 8 paintings that are that were commissioned to be displayed in Wallington Hall in Northumberland, and they show the history of Northumbria. And this is the last painting in that series, that history series, and it shows how, in this case, Newcastle is one of the centres of iron production and coal mining. But so we see here some muscular workers hitting an ingot of red hot iron. In the background, we see Stephenson's Bridge with the train going over the top, and underneath is a carriageway for coaches. On the River Tyne, we see a coal barge, we see lots of activity going on outside, but inside we see 2 children. Excuse me, I've just got to stop the video of these people who have just come on so they don't get recorded. Right. Inside we see 2 children, a boy who is not really dressed for the mine, but he's carrying a Davy lamp, and he's also carrying a whip here for mine ponies, and a bag containing his lunch. So he's carrying things that demonstrate that he's going down the mines to work, but this is not normally the way a child would dress down the mines. In front of him, in the foreground here, is a girl who is holding, we assume, her father's lunch, and we assume her father is one of these workers here, and she's got her dog with her. But what I think is more interesting is that there's a beam of sunlight coming down the picture just in front of her. Over to the right, there's a mechanical drawing of the latest Stephenson steam engine. In fact, you can see the actual steam engine going over the bridge in the background, and here's a mechanical drawing of it. And so this has been interpreted as the future. This girl is experiencing childhood because there's an ever lengthening period, this was painted in 1861, between being a toddler and going out to work, creating the opportunity for childhood and the opportunity to become better educated. In 1840, 60% of women were illiterate, but by 1860, it was down to 40%. And in fact, it was the 1880 Education Act that made free education mandatory for children between 5 and 10. But this girl, it's hard to see in this reproduction, but in the painting, you can see that this girl is holding a school arithmetic book. So she represents the future of a new educated youngsters who will be the adults of the future. But let's go back. So that gives you an optimistic tone of what's possible, what's going to become possible in the modern world. But let's go back 70 years and talk a bit about the rich. There's two rich, obviously wealthy children here, and the girl is giving a coin to the beggar, the poor boy. And scenes like this at the end of the 18th century, this was painted in 1793, scenes like this at the end of the 18th century were popular, emotive, emotional scenes of rural poverty were a popular type of painting. This is particularly large. It's about 6 foot by 4 foot. And we know that who the children are. It was actually painted for Sir Francis Ford, and they're his 2 children, the 2 wealthy children. And Francis Ford lived at Ember Court. So I thought I'd include this as it's got local interest, Ember Court in Thames Ditton. He only lived in the house for a few years. The house has obviously since been pulled down, but it was on the Ember Court estate. And what might not be obvious from this, because at first glance we see 2 children helping the poor, but this painting was actually a form of propaganda, because their father, Sir Francis Ford, was arguing in favor of slavery. Yes, he had slaves in Barbados, and he argued, he was an MP, he argued in Parliament against Wilberforce that his slaves in Barbados had a better standard of living than the poor in the slums of England. And so what he's showing here in this painting was that he and his family were helping the poor in England and providing a good life for the slaves in Barbados. Luckily, his view didn't prevail, and the Slavery Act of 1807 stopped the trade in slaves. But it does show you there was an enormous difference between the rich and the poor, which slowly reduced as the whole country became wealthier. But the problems of the children of the rich were very different from those of the poor. And I'll be talking most about the poor. The children of the rich suffered from very strict discipline, boredom, and a lack of any compassion. Winston Churchill, for instance, said that he could count on one hand the number of times that he was ever cuddled by his mother. Typical of a wealthy Victorian family. Right, there was also in the 19th century a big move from the countryside to the town, and I'll talk about that and the poor of the countryside and the town. Here we see three poor children who have just opened a gate for a gentleman. His presence, by the way, for those who haven't noticed it, is indicated by this shadow on the ground, shadow of a man riding a horse. So they've opened the gate, and the boy is touching his forelock as a note of civility. The painting, incidentally, is not intended to be ironic. That's a modern interpretation. William Collins was a Tory who we know opposed the Reform Bill of 1832, which gave some more people the vote. What he's saying in this painting, and another example of propaganda, is that the poor don't need the vote because they're well off, they're looked after, they have leisure time, and they're naturally subservient to gentlemen. That was his argument. So there's the idea of the deserving poor. It's probably best summarized by the hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful. If you remember, it was written in 1848, and it goes, "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate." In other words, Victorians, partly through religion, believed that poverty was ordained by God. However, Victorians had a bit of a dilemma because self-help was a great theme of the Victorian period, and they believed that anyone could better themselves. So how does that fit in with the poor? Well, they solved that problem by distinguishing between the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. The deserving poor were civil, like this boy here, worked hard, didn't drink, never complained, and tried to better themselves. So should be the object of charity. And the undeserving poor tried not to get out of work, drank, were lazy, and deserved their poverty because it was ordained by God anyway. The other thing to, I think, point out at this stage is child mortality. I'll be talking more about it later, but just to point out that around about 1840, that a third of children died before the age of 5, and in the slums it was something like a half of all children died before the age of 5, and 1 in 6 died before the age of 1. There was not much doctors could do to treat infectious diseases. More on that later. I'll be talking about health, but let's move on. A slightly lighter note here. This is an itinerant blind fiddler who travels around entertaining. And here we see a family being entertained, enthralled children here, listening to the music. There's a boy having fun over here, pretending to play some bellows as a fiddle. But in general, the family are appreciating the music. You might think that's all there is to it, but the critics at the time noticed something on the shelf up here. I've put a ring round that bust, that statuette. It was seen by critics to be a dissenting minister, and that indicated that this family were nonconformists, and nonconformists were known for being suspicious of music and pleasure. And so what this painting shows, another layer to this painting, is it's showing the power of music to stir the passions, even of those who are suspicious of pleasure. And that added, for the critics, it added to its subtlety. But what I really wanted to talk about was the date and what was going on down on the farm. It's 1806, and we're in the middle of a war with France. Napoleon has blockaded all the ports of Europe, and we depend on food from Europe. So we are not getting enough food in the country, and the pressure was on farmers to produce more food. And that resulted very rapidly in a burst of what's become known as the agricultural revolution, which consisted of enclosing common land and turning it into large fields that could be more productively farmed, and a massive increase in automation on the farm, which threw people out of work. So at the same time that factories in part of the Industrial Revolution were starting to open, initially in the countryside, but later in towns like Leeds, there were more and more farm workers out of a job looking for work. And in the past, if they were out of work, because many workers couldn't work full time, they had common land on which was divided into strips where they could grow food. But as the common land had been taken away from them, although they got a once-off recompense payment, that quickly disappeared. They couldn't grow their own food. So they were, if you like, forced to leave the countryside, but there were better paid jobs in the factories as well. So that was another thing that encouraged them to leave. So there was this massive move. At the beginning of the 19th century, the majority of people worked on the farm. By the end, the majority worked in factories and in towns. So talking about factories, I wanted to talk about some of the a few of the terrible things that happened. As I said, children were a cheap, expendable, and vast resource, as the way they were regarded, but they literally built the Victorian Britain. And historians have recently started to uncover testimonies, diaries, and parish records and notes that were taken of stories of children at the time. For example, there was one 13-year-old boy called Charles Bacon, who was auctioned to be an apprentice. This was standard practice because you had to pay so little for an apprentice. There was a source of cheap labor. And he had read Uncle Tom's Cabin. And he said that as he stood in the auction to be sold as an apprentice, he felt like one of the slaves in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And in fact, bound apprentices were much like slaves. And in some ways, it's been described as state-sponsored slavery. The first wave of children who worked in factories were made up of orphans. It was Oliver Twist in real life. The other shocking occupation for children was working down the mines, and the first government report on this wasn't until 1840. The conditions were appalling. The injuries were numerous. The government inspector in 1840 wrote that one pretty little girl of 6 years old called Mary Davis, he found fast asleep against a stone. And on being wakened, she told him, "I went to sleep because my lamp had gone out for want of oil and I was frightened, for someone had stolen my bread and cheese. I think it was the rats." The mines were full of rats and cockroaches, and there was very little light. The children were worked all day. There were back injuries. There was the report that the government produced led to the Act of 1842, but the public who read the report, it wasn't the injuries and the working of children that appalled them so much as the fact that the report said that women and girls, because it was so hot down the mines, women and girls went topless because of the heat. It was the sexual scandal of men and women working together, with women being topless down the mine, that shocked everybody, that resulted in the Mines Act. Another little girl aged 8 said, "Sometimes I sing, but never in the dark. I don't like being in the pit. I'm scared." And although we think of mines and factories, they weren't actually the biggest employer at the beginning of the Victorian period. It was still agriculture. And you might think that that was a much better employment for young children, but in some ways it was actually worse. Children started when they could stand 4, 5 or 6. And one of the occupations for children was human scarecrows. They spent all day standing on their own in a field. One little girl said, "I cried all day, mother, mother, mother," but she couldn't hear me. A boy said, by 7, I was driving a plough and he had to carry a 40-pound horse halter to the blacksmith, which damaged his back for life. In fact, it appalls me when I hear the phrase, hard work never did any harm. Well, it did. It distorted young bodies. It led to death, early death. The average height of the population fell in this period, and children grew up as adults with knock knees, humpbacks, damaged pelvises from standing 14 hours a day. But let's move on. There's a lot more I could say, but let's move on to the towns and the workhouse. It was in 1834 that the new Poor Law introduced the work. There were workhouses before then, but it introduced a new concept of the workhouse, which it was designed, really the aim of the new Poor Law was to reduce the cost of looking after the poor. And the idea of the workhouse is that it had to be worse than the worst forms of employment. Otherwise, people would, they thought, would want to go into the workhouse. And we've seen how bad that could be. So you can imagine how bad the workhouse was. But sometimes you see here in the cold, people queuing. You couldn't just go into the workhouse. There was a part of the workhouse called the casual ward, and that was where you could stay for one night. But to get in, you had to get a ticket from the police. And these people are queuing outside a police station. This is a police station. And I think this man has just got a ticket and the policeman is explaining, I think, where the workhouse is. And these are applicants for admission to a casual ward, that is a one-night ward in the workhouse. But you could only stay one night. If you stayed longer, you were actually taken into the workhouse, and that meant the family was split up. The workhouses were divided into sections, one for men, one for women, and one for children. So, and there was often, for some people, little chance of ever getting out again. It was actually slave labor, if you like. They worked all day. And Dickens described these conditions, and underneath this painting, when it was displayed at the Royal Academy, there was a sentence by Dickens: "Dumb, wet, silent horrors, sphinxes set up against that dead wall, and none likely to be at the pains of solving them until the general overthrow." Dickens went round London helping people in these queues. One time he found what looked like a pile of old rags, but it was young girls queuing to spend the night in a casual ward. He tried to intervene with the master. They were called guardians of the workhouse, but it was full. So he gave each girl a shilling, but they were so low, so tired, they didn't even have the energy to thank him. And below the beggars of London, there was actually another category called the crawlers. This photograph is from a book called Street Life in London. The photographs were taken by John Thompson, and the essays were written by a journalist called Adolph Smith. And they interviewed everyone who worked on the streets: cab drivers, flower sellers, sign painters, locksmiths, fishmongers, doctors, itinerant doctors, street musicians and beggars. And as I said, a crawler is a beggar who is so poor and weak from hunger that he or she can no longer beg, but they rely on essentially being supported by beggars. The beggars who regarded themselves, we can see from the interviews, as a bit of a profession, that they've regarded it as a skill to get money out of people. I'm not saying they did well, but they made enough to barely survive and to eat. And the crawlers were people who didn't even have the energy to beg, and so they got occasional food from the beggars. This woman is looking after a baby, actually a baby, she said, of a former crawler who managed to get a job in a shop from 10 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, and in fact again in the evening, I think from 8 till 10 in the evening, which is when this crawler looked after the baby for her, and in exchange she got on good days she got a cup of tea, 1 cup of tea, and a tiny piece of bread. On bad days, one or the other, and on some days neither. They actually lived on steps like this in all weathers. The interesting thing, I think, is that when they interviewed this woman, she actually had dreams that if she could earn a few shillings, which she thought was possible to save up, she could travel to the hop fields, and there because she'd done it in the past, she could save £1, and with £1 she could rent a room, and with an address she could start to work again. She was actually a skilled tailoress, but and her son, who also was out of work, could get his clothes out of the pawn shop and get a job. So she had dreams about how she could improve herself, but I don't know whether they ever came about. I said I'd talk a bit more about health, medicine and lifespan. I already mentioned that a third of children died before the age of 5. It's interesting, I think, because you might read that the average lifespan in 1840 was about 30, which it was. But if you remove children under 5, from the age of 5, the average lifespan was similar to today. Slightly less in 1840, I think it was 75 for men and 73 for women, a bit lower for women because of the dangers of childbirth. So it was, this is for the average family. And in fact, between 1850 and 1870, there was a bit of a golden age when the lifespan for some groups was longer than it is today, because they had such a good diet. The diseases that we know today, the degenerative diseases like heart attack, diabetes, lung cancer, were virtually unknown. So what changed? Well, around in the 1870s, the diet changed. 1875, salted, or what's called corned beef, was imported from Argentina. Sugar-laden condensed milk became available. Fruit became canned in syrup. White bread was introduced, such that by 1900, half the young men who volunteered for the Boer War were rejected as undernourished. They were eating the wrong food. Their teeth were so poor, they couldn't eat vegetables, fruit and nuts. Now, that was just a bit about lifespan of adults. For children, it was common for families to be large. These are larger than average. The average family in 1860 was, I think, 6 children, but by 1910, it had gone down to 3 children. There were various theories put forward, but it was an increasingly wealthy society, and there was a shift from children being regarded as an economically useful asset to the idea of the dependent and sacred child within a nuclear family by 1910. And so there was little contraception, another reason for large families. Everyone was in more or less permanent mourning. Women were more or less permanently pregnant. And families like this of 11 children, or I think it's 18 I counted in the other picture, weren't unusual, were common. And in poor families, the children were an asset. As soon as they were old enough to work, 5 or 6, although they might not be paid much, even a little helped a family, and the children knew it. They were proud of the fact that they were helping the family, we know from records at the time. Incidentally, I should mention at this point, because of the number of children that died so young, with the invention of photography in the 1830s, it meant that there was, you might have seen pictures like this before. It's called Taken from Life, the Unsettling Art of Death Photography. The young child on the left is dead. Because there were no degenerative diseases, infectious diseases, diphtheria, typhus, cholera, measles, could kill overnight. So children could die very, very quickly, and there was little that could be done. And so to remember them, the Victorian family, who loved them as much as we do today, would take a photograph of them to help remember them, which was possible with the invention of photography. The other thing I should mention in terms of the poor is the dependency on harvests. Now, in the 1816, for example, was the year without a summer, terrible harvests in the 1820s, the 1830s, a lot of poor harvests. The weather improved from the 1850s. From the 1850s, there were good harvests most years. But the thing I wanted to talk about here was this painting by George Frederick Watts on the Irish famine. Remember, at this stage, from the beginning of the 19th century, it was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. It was part of the United Kingdom, and the famine between 1846 and 1850, caused by potato blight, killed 1 million people in Ireland. It's a quarter of the population, and millions emigrated. The population halved. And at the same time as potato blight was rampant and the poor lived off potatoes, there were 30 to 50 shiploads of food a day being sent to England, more than enough to feed the Irish population. Some historians have described this as genocide. A final note of on health. I've spoken about medicine. There wasn't much during most of the Victorian age that a doctor could do. This is a painting called The Doctor. It's by Luke Fildes again, and it's a night vigil by a doctor. Now, it actually helps here if I talk a little bit about the background. In 1890, Sir Henry Tate commissioned Luke Fildes. He paid him £3,000, a lot of money then, to paint a picture of his choice. He didn't say what Luke Fildes should paint, and the artist chose to paint a personal tragedy. Was about 13 years previously, his first son, Philip Luke, had died at the age of 1 in his Kensington home. As I said, these high rates of child death applied equally to the rich and to the poor. And the doctor who treated him, Gustavus Murray, was still inspired by it. And so this painting was as a remembrance of the dedication and the professional devotion of Dr. Murray, who Fylde said would one day inspire the painting of the doctor. Now, we see some medicine on the table here. We see the doctors mixed it in this cup. We see on the floor what are probably prescriptions. The child doesn't even have a bed, is lying between 2 chairs. The father behind is looking worried, and the mother is praying. By the way, Luke Fylde constructed this room in his studio. And outside we see, and this is the note of hope, we see the dawn light, because it was regarded at the time that if a child got very ill, if they could survive till the morning, then there was hope for them. And so this, unlike his own son who died, in this painting, Fylde is showing the redeeming light of dawn and the first sign of recovery of the child. So the viewer of the painting would conclude that the child will survive. And this is in fact one of the paintings that became the foundation of the Tate, because Henry Tate donated this, in fact all of his paintings, all 56 of his paintings, as a gift to the nation in 1897, and that became the beginnings of the Tate collection. Let me quickly run through a little bit more about what the family unit. There's a lot to be said about this, but I'll concentrate on the children. Just this painting by Winterhalter, The Royal Family in 1846, was commissioned by Queen Victoria, and it's part of her, what I think of as her propaganda drive. She was very good at promoting a certain image of herself and her family, which later she did with photography. But this is is hanging in the dining room at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight. In fact, we can see the sea in the background, and she is shown as the mother of the family. She's shown as and she had many children. We see here 6 years after she married, she has 5 children. The future King Edward, then Prince of Wales, is shown standing next to her, wearing a sort of a Russian costume. The next youngest son of the family, Albert, is shown here. Of course, in those days, under the age of 3, boys and girls would wear dresses. And then over the other side are the 3 daughters of the family. The eldest child, Victoria, here looking down at the youngest, Helena, Princess Helena. I don't want to spend a long time on this, except to give the idea of the Victorian family and its structure. Lots of children, the father in charge, and the way that's shown in this painting is that although of course she was in charge of the country, she's showing herself as deferential within the family unit by showing Prince Albert's head is slightly higher than her head, and he's nearer us than she is. But let me show you a different slant or a different take on the family. And this is 1856, Many Happy Returns of the Day by William Powell Frith. and it's celebrated, it's Frith, and this is actually a self-portrait of Frith here, celebrating the birthday of his 6-year-old daughter Alice, shown here with the wreath around her. He's just about to toast her, but he's waiting for the eldest member of the family, his father, to receive a glass of wine or sherry from his daughter here in order to toast Alice. Meanwhile, a servant is standing ready with a collection of presents to give to Alice. So the modern idea of childhood is being developed here in this painting. We're beginning to see some aspects of the modern idea of childhood, which started earlier in wealthy families. However, what I wanted to say, which wasn't obvious from this painting, and wasn't obvious to anyone at the time, but became known later, is that Frith led an unusual double life, a double domestic life. He was married to Isabel, who we see here, had 12 children by her, but down the road, I think about a mile down the road, he had a mistress, Mary Alford, who was in fact his ward and who visited the family to look after the children. And by her, he had another 7 children. Now, Isabel, his wife, didn't know about Mary Alford, but she found out after this was exhibited. She caught him down the road posting a letter when he said he was in Brighton. And obviously he used excuses about visiting parts of the country to go down the road to visit his mistress. And this became public knowledge later. And in fact, later again, his wife died and he married Mary Alford. So I won't spend more time talking about the concept of manliness in the Victorian period, a complex subject which involves a great deal of hypocrisy. But let's talk briefly, or show you briefly, the what was expected of a woman and how that related to childhood, which was one of the missions of women. In fact, I simplify here, but and we'll see it's a bit more complicated on the next slide, but simplistically, the choice for a woman was marriage or prostitution. And prostitution, they could make a lot of money quickly. But as a wife, they were expected to be pure, unworldly, innocent, and described in one poem by Coventry Patmore as the angel in the house. In fact, I think I've got time to read you John Ruskin's description of women. He wrote, "The woman's power is for rule, not battle, and her intellect is not for invention or creation, but for sweet ordering, arrangement, and decision. Her function is praise. By her office and place, she is protected from all danger and temptation. This is the true nature of home. It is the place of peace, the shelter, not only from all injury, but from all terror, doubt, and division." Well, that view of John Ruskin might explain why his marriage to Effie Gray only lasted a few years and ended in annulment because of his inability to consummate the marriage. She then, Effie Gray, married John Everett Millais, who we'll see one of his paintings later. But you've probably already seen the 3 missions for women: companion to manhood, guide of childhood, and comfort of old age. But let's move on from that to talk about the opportunities available for poor and middle class women, the jobs that were available. I said that there were very few jobs available. In fact, between 1850 and 70, it's now believed that far more women worked than previously thought. The reason we thought few women worked was because the census doesn't record it. And we now think that there was something like 30 to 40% of women earned, worked, and that percentage of women wasn't higher until after World War II. Their work wasn't recorded for a number of reasons. I think probably because the man was seen as central to the family, and they didn't want to undermine that by putting the women's job on the census form. But women worked in the family business. They were many were domestic servants, I think about 40%, or they worked in a textile factory, in the local pottery. They worked in brewing, provisioning, seamstressing, and so on. But here, there's a girl who is in mourning, and we are to assume, I think, that her parents have died. And the boy with her, we can assume, is her brother. She's fairly well dressed, and so she comes from a wealthy family, but middle-class families were, most were on the brink, because the man would earn, the man and the woman would earn just enough to keep the family going. So if the man died, they could become destitute overnight. So it seems that this young girl has been trained to paint. She's brought a painting in to this shop to sell it. The man behind the counter is looking doubtful, but the way I interpret this painting is, I think the man up here, or the assistant up here, is looking at the painting rather than the girl, implying that it's rather a good painting, and that this man therefore is looking doubtful in order to negotiate a better price. That's my interpretation anyway. And meanwhile, over here, these two men are looking salaciously at the young girl, because they know, because she's in mourning, that she has no source of income. She's trying to make money selling paintings, which is extremely hard. In fact, this was painted by a woman, Emily Osborne. So it was possible. I won't talk about her whole life, which is extremely interesting, but when she was 17, she first exhibited at the Royal Academy, and the painting she exhibited sold for 200 guineas, and she sold another painting that year when she was 17 to the Queen. So when she was 17, it was overnight, she became an established painter. Once you've sold to royalty, then that's a big tick. And she exhibited, of course, she couldn't become a member of the Royal Academy as a woman, but she exhibited at the Royal Academy for the next 40 years, a very successful woman artist. And this year, 1857, is when she was one of the founders of the Society of Female Artists. So there were some female artists. You might have seen this in the Tate, Augustus Egg Past and Present. It's a series of 3 paintings, and this is what can befall a woman. In fact, there was 1857 was the Matrimonial Causes Act, where for the first time middle-class families could afford to get divorced. And I think this might be a comment on that, that with the new act, this family could get divorced. But before then, there was no divorce for a middle-class family. What's going on here is that he's just received a letter, I think, telling him that his wife has committed adultery. She has a lover, because he's grinding a picture of her lover under his foot. But let's concentrate on the children. These 2 children here don't really know what's going on. This older child looks worried. The house of cards they've just built on a French novel by Balzac. You can't read that here, but you can in the painting. The house of cards is collapsing as the family collapses. 5 years later, the 2 girls have grown up. Their father has died. This older girl or woman is in mourning. The father's picture is there and the mother's picture is there. You might have seen them on the wall of the house, of the room they were in. But look at the moon and this cloud, because in the next picture, the final of this triptych, the same moon in the cloud, in other words, the same day and the same time, their mother is shown here under the arches of the Adelphi, which was between the Hungerford Bridge and Waterloo Bridge. I think it's now Victoria Embankment Gardens. But she's looking out at the moon, and you'll see sticking out from under her cloak, there are the emaciated legs of a young child, possibly dead. She's the fallen wife. And this is the message, to the Victorian message from this is this is what befalls a woman who commits adultery. And this is highlighted by these posters. This is a play called Victims, another play called Cure for Love, and they're both about adultery and unhappy marriages. And here it says pleasure excursions to Paris, which is a hint at the novel. I mentioned the novel by Balzac. Well, the Victorians regarded French novels as extolling adultery, and that people who read these novels would get seduced into committing adultery. I'm showing, this is the painting I mentioned by John Everett Millais called My First Sermon. And here again, we are seeing the signs of childhood as a special stage of life. This is called My First Sermon. It was very well accepted by the Victorian public, to the extent that the following year he painted this, My Second Sermon, as a bit of a joke. The Archbishop of Canterbury took it as a warning to vicars, the evil of lengthy sermons and drowsy discourses. He blamed the vicars rather than the children. The other thing about this painting is that it was painted in All Saints Church in Kingston, so there's a local angle to it as well. But it shows how, and this continued to develop from the 1860s onwards, there was a new fascination with this idea of childhood. It was there was a strong cultural move to idealize children and turn them into objects of beauty. They were often, children were associated with strong faith and innocence. And the shortness of childhood was increasingly seen to be a poignant aspect of childhood because of its brevity. And it was also a time when these children became adorable as a general concept of childhood. Obviously, mothers and fathers always loved their children. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that this idea of childhood developed, of children being vulnerable and requiring vigilant adult concern and protection from a harsh world. But let's finish with a lighter note. Holidays. Now, this goes some way back. It's in fact predates the Queen Victoria became queen, or Victoria became queen in 1837. So this is a bit before the strict Victorian period. And it shows May Day, Punch or May Day celebration. And there were a number of days of the year, Christmas in particular, where there were holidays, but there wasn't the concept of going away on holiday. That started to develop at the end of the 18th century for the wealthy. This is after the idea of going away for a few years on a grand tour of Europe. In May Day, on this particular day, we can see a lot going on here, a very crowded scene in Marylebone High Street. And this is at the end of the Regency period. The crowds have blocked the street. This carriage here, which contains a newly married couple, is blocking this here, which is a hearse with a coffin on the back. And so it's showing all life is here, from youngsters to marriage to death. But the center point is this Punch and Judy show. And just point out what's going on here. This man here is dressed as a wealthy farmer. and he's entranced by the Punch and Judy show, although of course they had them in the country as well. But what's going on is that this boy here, if you look carefully, his hand is coming around to take something, maybe a wallet, out of the farmer's pocket. Behind the farmer, there's a sailor who would see what was going on, except that the woman here is covering the boy with this shawl and is lowering her eyes in an attractive way to gain the attention of the sailor and take his attention away from the boy with her who's stealing money from this man. So it's everyday life in the streets of London. You'll also notice a fairly well-dressed street seller here with, I think, just one example, a few grapes, an apple and so on, selling her wares on a small table. And then over the other side, you will have probably already noticed this strange triplet of a boy with his face blacked, a woman dressed in red, and they were always dressed in red, and carrying a ladle. And this here, which looks like a tree, is a moving tree, because if you look very carefully, I'll point there, you can see somebody's eye. It's a man dressed as a tree. It's the Green Man or Jack in the Tree. So this is a Morris Day, a May Day dancing. And I'll just concentrate on the boy here. Why is his face blacked? We don't know. It possibly represents chimney sweeps. That was another occupation for young children, which I haven't had time to discuss. It possibly represents miners, boys going down the mines. It even's been suggested that it is children descended from North African pirates. And North African pirates, I don't know whether you know, used to raid ports in England and to take men and women into slavery and sell them in the towns and cities of North Africa. It was a common occurrence to be raided by pirates, but some of the pirates, some of the North African pirates, stayed and settled in England in the ports. I carry on with this painting. There's a lot to say about this painting, Ramsgate Sands by William Powell Frith, because there's so much going on. In fact, one of my supervisors at university wrote a thesis on which a quarter of the thesis was describing every single person in this painting and their likely occupation. But what it really is celebrating is holidays for the first time. People were able to get to Ramsgate by train and take holidays. Even the poor, or the relatively poor, not the beggars, the poor the working class could afford a train journey to Ramsgate for a day out. And so I'll concentrate on the children, and I'll concentrate on this. I don't know whether it's a boy or a girl. I think it's a boy because he's in a plainer dress than these girls here. This, by the way, I think is the daughter of William Powell Frith, modelled for this. But this boy is an amusing incident here. This boy here is looking using a telescope, and that is mirrored in this old man who's using a telescope. So what are they looking at? Well, the clue is over here with these bathing machines. It's being suggested that they're looking through their telescopes, particularly the old man is looking through his telescope at the women emerging from the back of the bathing machines for a dip in the sea as part of their holiday. And then the final picture painting that I wanted to show you by James Clark is called Christmas. And this is just after the end of the Victorian period. It's 1902 and Victoria died in 1901, but it shows you how the Victorians invented a lot of the conventions in Christmas. They didn't invent Christmas. Arguably, Christmas goes back to the Roman Saturnalia celebration, but they did introduce Christmas trees. You see one here, decorated Christmas tree, mistletoe. I think this is holly above the mantelpiece here. The idea of roast turkey, and that's just been cleared from the table down here, and the Christmas pudding in celebration. And what we see here is a family unit, and notice the children around the table as part of the party. Although Christmas had been celebrated, for example, in the 18th century, it tended to be, I don't mean children weren't involved, but it tended to be around parties and drinking and celebrations by adults. But by the end of the 19th century, it was a celebration that centered around the family, the Victorian family, and the children in the family, and the giving of presents became increasingly important. So I will call an end to my short talk at that point. There's a lot I haven't been able to cover, but let me just end with one quote from a book on the childhood and child labour in the British Industrial Revolution. The book's called. In 1880, the Compulsory Education Act helped reduce the number of child labourers, and subsequent laws raised their age and made working conditions safer. But it had come too late for the little white slaves on whose blood, sweat and toil our great railways, bridges and buildings of the Industrial Revolution were built. Thank you.